Today, together with our philosopher friend, Gualtiero Piccinini, we will be exploring the nature of the mind, how it works, how to understand it using both neuroscience and cognition, a kind of cognitive neuroscience, and how to access and explain the different layers of it. Yep, we'll be talking about sleep, meditation, consciousness, identity, and how to better understand and connect to that little brain of yours. This is my conversation with Gualtiero Piccinini. How would you describe the central question that motivates your work in philosophy of mind? And how would you describe it for people who've never done philosophy before?
I'd say understand how the mind works. That's the short answer.
So, how does the mind work? I mean, this is going to be what we're talking about basically for an hour or so. But let's get it going.
I'd say that again, the short answer is that it's a multi-scale, multi-level, complex physical system designed to keep the organism functioning and pursue certain goals. There's a whole hierarchy of goals. It requires adapting to the environment. That itself requires understanding and knowing what's out there to some degree, meaning at a certain scale, certain physical scales, mesoscales, mid-sized objects have a model of what's happening, what the organism itself is doing in its environment, what's out there, not just in the immediate, vicinity, but also far away. Be able to predict to some degree what's going to happen, and so to do that, it needs something like a model or simulation of itself in its environment, and it needs to be updated constantly. And it needs to be also adjusted for two things. One, what the organism itself is doing at any moment, because that makes a difference to whether the changes that are being perceived are due to what the organism is doing or they're due to things changing on their own. And the other thing is what matters. There's things that matter, things that don't matter. So, do we have enough water in our cells? Or are we thirsty? Or, do we have enough energy? Or do we need to eat? Is it too cold, too hot? Or do we want to find a mate or shelter, et cetera, et cetera. So there's things that matter and we need to evaluate them. And, there's potential predators, dangers, risks, and we need to be able to distinguish all of these things to make good decisions. So this internal model that's ongoing, it's to include this information. It's not just what there is, but is what's out there good, bad, or indifferent. That's sort of the big picture.
Okay. Yeah. So thinking back on past philosophers in history, and how they thought of the mind, in terms of how it relates to the body and the environment, and it sounds like there might be even more than that. Maybe you can teach us a couple of those, and then show us how your view of things differ or relate to some of these other philosophies.
I'd say there are you can divide, ancient views into two camps. There's the more rationalistic camp that divides the rational mind from other things like emotion or sleep or arousal, and says, well, what's really important and characteristic is to be rational, and rational, means maybe something like pursuing the truth. And then there's another camp that says, well, really emotion value evaluations, bodily needs, bodily functions are too intertwined with everything we do to separate the two. Maybe emotion is even above reason. Maybe that's the most important thing, and reason follows. And we end up believing what we want to believe. And I think the truth is maybe a little bit in the middle, but leaning in the direction of the second view, meaning the two things are very intertwined, not fully separable. But I don't go as far as say, oh, we're going to believe what we want to believe. Yeah, sometimes we do, but we don't have to. And we can try to find the middle ground and stay grounded in reality, but also we still have to always assess what's important and what it's not. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm never gonna fully understand anything, but you also mentioned there's different levels of the mind. Can you explain that more?
Yeah. This is another way in which what I said, differs from some of the more traditional ways of thinking. So, one very influential way of thinking in the sciences of the mind is that the mind itself lives at this special autonomous level, the cognitive level, or the computational level, or something like that, and that's the goal of psychology or maybe philosophy of mind is to study that, understand that, and we don't need to worry too much about the quote unquote implementation or the mechanisms because they could be anything. What we really need to understand is the algorithm or the cognitive stuff or the representations. And I think this is misleading at best. I mean, this assumption was pretty dominant in cognitive science in various incarnations. I mean, there was like a classical version, there was a connectionist version. And what I think turns out to be the case is that number one, there's not just one cognitive or mental or computational level, there's many levels of organization in the brain and the nervous system in the body. And at many of these levels, there's cognitive stuff going on. There's, computations being performed, but also things being assessed for whether they're good or bad and so forth. And there is, this interdependence between all these levels of organization. Levels of organization, I mean things like cells, circuits, larger structures, large scale networks, cortical and subcortical in the brain, for example. There's like the cerebral cortex, which is a huge structure, but there's also a lot of other things beneath the cortex, and they interact with the cortex and with each other in complicated ways. And it all matters and it all makes a difference. And you have to understand how the brain works to even try to hope to get at what the principles are, what the processing principles, what the algorithms are. You can't just focus on the computations or the representations and think that that's one separate level from the rest. It all happens inside the brain in its own special way, and all these different levels are also interdependent.
Okay, and you mentioned computation, and that's a big part of your work. Can you explain how the brain is a computing system, or parts of it are, and how that differs from other kinds of computers?
Yeah. So this is one of the ideas that really got the contemporary science of the mind going in around the 1940s and 50s. There was the cognitive revolution, and it was in part based on this analogy between minds and computers. And the most influential version of that was literally an analogy between minds and digital computers, like those that we use today, which is still an influential idea. There were also other people who pushed for an analogy between minds and analog computers. That's a different type of technology that's not really used anymore much, a little bit maybe. And I mean, I have argued that although there's something to these analogies, very, very loosely speaking, at a very coarse level of grain, we really have to study how the brain itself works. And to the extent that it even makes sense to say that the brain does computations, these are computations done in a style that belongs to the brain itself, that evolve with the nervous system, and that depends on these the interactions between neural systems and at different levels, so different levels of organization at different scales, and can only be understood by studying how the brain works. We're not going to get a lot of mileage out of comparing the brain to a digital computer, to an analog computer, or to any other technology that we create. And there's many reasons for this. We can get into some of them if you want, but the important point is to understand how the brain works or the mind works, we need to understand, the internal mechanisms of the brain. So even this applies to the computations themselves.
So you're saying that neuroscience and cognitive science are both important, and we need to find a way to kind of see them as part of the same thing, or how would you describe the relationship between cognitive science and neuroscience, and how we should approach it in the future?
Great. So that's an excellent question. The term itself, neuroscience, I think was coined in the maybe late 60s. And it was an attempt to bring together all these different disciplines that studied the brain and the nervous system, in different ways at different scales. There was neurology, neurophysiology, neuropsychology, and so forth. And then somebody else, in the late 70s thought, oh, and we should do something even more broad called cognitive science that includes some neuroscience as one component, but then, it also adds psychology, linguistics, cognitive anthropology, philosophy, and maybe artificial intelligence. But the way it was initially conceptualized, cognitive science was something that included neuroscience as a component, but it also included these other things. And I think what happened, but it really, the way these people thought initially was that there was this cognitive level that I was talking about before, and it was sort of distinct from the brain somehow, like the software, like this is the level of the computer software. The neuroscience studies the hardware, but we're just going to focus on the software in cognitive science. And that analogy turns out to break down. That's not a good way to think about the relation between neural computation and the neural mechanisms. So, what I think happened instead is that some neuroscientists said, well, we want to study cognition too, and we're going to study them by understanding the mechanisms involved. And so they coined the term cognitive neuroscience. And this happened in the 80s. So, so you've got neuroscience, then there's the cognitive science, then there's cognitive neuroscience. And ultimately, I think that's the more helpful label, cognitive neuroscience, meaning, yeah, we want to study cognition, but we are going to have to understand how the brain works to do that. There's no such thing as this like software level in the brain. In a sense that's helpful. That's helpful, like this, just study that and don't worry about the underlying mechanisms. So the way to go is we're going to have to do cognitive neuroscience. And that's what cognitive science really is becoming, or has become to some degree, and is becoming more and more. Maybe not everybody's on board yet, but it's more and more accepted that you can't just study cognition without also studying how the brain works.
But then we get to one of the big problems in philosophy of consciousness and how it arises. So how do we get from what they were calling the hardware level to the software level, from the neurons and the neural mechanisms and the brain networks and parts of the brain and stuff, to this subjective experience that we're having?
That is a tough question. One important note relating to what we just said is these people who founded cognitive science, they were not going to worry about consciousness. So consciousness itself was still off limits at this point, say in the 70s and 80s when cognitive science was being started as a self-conscious enterprise. And certainly even before, like in the cognitive revolution, people said that's why they started talking about cognition so that they didn't have to talk about consciousness. This was like it was a conscious decision that they made. But then some people started saying, okay, but what about consciousness? And, there was a debate. And by the 90s, a lot of scientists started saying, well, I think we can study consciousness too. So that got sort of back in from the back door of the science of cognition and the brain. And interestingly, it was more driven by neuroscience than by psychology or quote unquote cognitive science, at least to a large degree. So I think, yeah, consciousness is a huge part of the story of how the brain works. And, there's now a fairly sophisticated sub-discipline, the scientific study of consciousness, and it's more continuous with neuroscience and what I'm talking about than with cognitive science or cognitive psychology, insofar as some people still think of that as distinct from neuroscience. And yeah, I didn't really get to the deeper question, like, okay, but how do we address the hard problem? The hard problem is supposed to be that it's difficult, or maybe some people claim impossible, to understand how some physical system, like a brain or a nervous system, could give rise to subjective experience. Because subjective experience just seems so different from anything that you can grasp by still just conceptualizing a physical system, which you normally do in the third person. It's saying like, okay, there's these objects, these parts, and they do this, then and the other, and how could that give rise to like an internal subjective feeling of something? But some people, myself included, think that the more we understand the neural mechanisms at different scales and how the different scales are interacting and interdependent, and the details of what they do and how they do it. And I would add, the more we analyze consciousness itself in a careful way and relate the different aspects of it to the functioning of the brain, the less pressing the hard problem is going to be. So, for example, there's this very distinguished consciousness researcher whose name is Anil Seth, and he argues that if we understand how different aspects of the brain and the neural mechanisms affect the different types of conscious states that we have, and we learn to explain the differences between conscious states in terms of the differences between what's happening in the brain, and we learn to control to some degree, what kind of experiences we give rise to by messing with the brain in various ways, the more we basically are going to dissolve the hard problem of consciousness. Now, I don't think that's all we need to do. I think we also need to do some good philosophy, but we can certainly make progress, I think.
Right. And this analogy that I'm about to give might be completely off, but it's like we have this computer in front of us and the visuals come off of the screen, and you might say, how the hell did that happen from this physical computer? And of course our eyes and our nervous system is part of this, so maybe that's the consciousness, but still it's quite bizarre to think, okay, from this computer, these like digital neurons or whatever you want to call them, chips and things, is giving rise to these visuals and these sounds and things, or in a virtual reality headset, it's just this hardware, and it results in this software. So there's something more going on because we're part of it, our eyes and our nervous system and our brains interacting with that. But it's still like, oh, well, we understand how the computer was made, so we know how it gives rise to different functions like the audio, the speaker, the visuals, or whatever. So maybe if we can understand our brain, the real neuroscience, then yeah, it won't be such a mystery anymore.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that we also need to analyze more closely consciousness itself, and kind of break it down into its different aspects, because I don't think it's just one thing. I think it's many different things coming together. But yeah, by combination of conceptual advances and empirical advances, and modeling, there's going to be some theory and some modeling to do. We can make some progress. I myself have a project of working on this at some point. It's just that right now I have to do something else first.
And you said it's not just one consciousness. There's many different kinds of consciousness. I don't know what to call it. This is fascinating. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. So the main distinction that's used in recent decades is a distinction between so-called phenomenal consciousness, which is the qualitative aspect of experience itself, the redness of an experience of red versus the greenness of the experience of green, or the way that a rose smells versus the way an orange smells. That's called phenomenal consciousness. And then there's something that people call access consciousness, which is just the availability of information to the brain itself or the mind for the purposes of decision making, reporting to other people, kind of global control of the organism. This distinction is mostly due to a philosopher named Ned Block. And I think that that is sort of a helpful first step in analyzing consciousness. But there's more that we can distinguish. And I'm not the only one who draws some of these distinctions, but I think that there's more work to do in this direction. So, one thing that I think is very important, sometimes underestimated, is the different kinds of what some people might call creature consciousness, meaning global states of the brain. Okay, so the first important distinction is between normal wakefulness, when you have like a normal kind of experience like now, you and I, and different sleep stages. But even within wakefulness and sleep, there's many different kinds of kind of global states. So the most obvious is between when you're dreaming, you have like a vivid dream, like a movie in your head, and when you're not dreaming, but you're still asleep. But even then, there's an important distinction between there's three main stages of non-REM sleep. There's like very light sleep, there's kind of an intermediate kind of sleep, and then there's like deep, slow wave sleep. And all these states have different kind of neural signatures. They can be distinguished by doing, EEG, which is just recording electrical waves from your scalp. So your brain kind of slows down in its activity. Like the brain has this rhythmic activity always going on, but it can be a little faster, with slower amplitude. Like the electrical waves are fast and short, or it can be slower, but maybe like the waves are a little bit wider. And one thing that I think is very fascinating that I've experimented with myself, using a certain technique that I modified called descriptive experience sampling, is that most people, when they are not dreaming, they expect that they are unconscious. That's what I thought. What do you think? Do you think that when you are asleep but not dreaming, do you have conscious thoughts or not most of the time?
Hmm. I'm not sure. I'm leaning towards yes, because recently I've been getting into meditation more, and with meditation, it's like it's making me question all these things a bit more because you're like, whoa, even like different types of meditation give you access to different types of consciousness or reality. So I'm starting to question all these kinds of things, like what is good and what is bad, who am I, what is reality, what is human, and so I just got out of a Vipassana 10-day retreat, so now I'm like in the middle of processing all of this, but I've been trying different techniques, almost the opposite of that one. Because like Vipassana, for example, is very focus based and very much like analytical and control your desires and wants and become like almost like pure disciplined mind. But then that was helpful. But then I started to sample with these more kind of open awareness techniques or Dzogchen or something where you're just there, and it's a different vibe. So I'm like, wait, which is right? Which is me? Where's the path to go? But they're all sort of, I feel like there's some kind of consciousness with all of them. It's just a different sort of flavor and it's doing something different. It's like, well, what is the most useful kind of meditation for my goals in life? And also, which one of these is me? Was the thing in Vipassana, was that me? Or was this thing just sitting there in open awareness me? Or is it my normal habitual me who's running around making jokes and I don't know, maybe causing some people suffering, but also, I mean, myself some joy. So this is a big ramble that I just spilled out, but I think it'll get the gears rolling for you. So
It's exactly what I'm talking about. So there's all these different types of consciousness that you can enter and exit depending on different variables, which to some degree you can try to affect yourself by using these different meditation techniques. I do a lot of meditation myself, so I've also experimented with some of this stuff. And the reason I started with sleep and not with meditation is that more people are familiar with sleep than with meditation. But, going back to sleep, the question was, are we mostly conscious or unconscious when we sleep? And the answer, I think, is, to many people's surprise, including myself, mostly conscious. So everybody knows that we have REM sleep and we dream vividly, more or less during REM sleep, and then we forget most of the dreams. Most people know that. But what most people don't know is that even when we're in non REM sleep, we don't have vivid dreams, but we have thoughts that we always immediately forget. And you can, I convinced myself of this by doing this thing called descriptive experience sampling, meaning, have a method for waking me up very sharply and very suddenly to see if I could catch the thought or the experience that I was having at the moment of the alarms. Call it an alarm. It's slightly more sophisticated than that. And it was extremely hard to find any time when I was not thinking of something in my sleep, unless I caught myself in the deepest phase of sleep. So there is this like slow wave sleep, the deep sleep phase that really only happens early in the night during the first couple of sleep cycles. Normally people go through like 5 sleep cycles per night. And in the first couple, there's this phase called deep sleep. And during that phase, there's no thoughts, no experiences. Like your brain is like so shut down that there's no consciousness at all. But otherwise, there's something going on in there. You just forget it. You don't retain it. So that tells you, a couple of things. One, there's all these different types of consciousness, some of which you may not ever remember. You may not be aware that you have it. And second, memory is a huge part of that. Because if you don't have a mechanism for retaining enough of the information that you can then, for example, report it to someone else or write it down, you don't even realize that it's there. So this is something that philosophers have not discussed. Like most people don't even know about this, but it's the kind of thing that we need to think about to make progress on understanding consciousness. And then, there's other things, but hopefully this gives you at least the beginning of an answer to what you were asking. And the meditation that you described is another side to the answer.
What is descriptive experience sampling? You mentioned you wake yourself up at certain weird random times of the night, or maybe they're not so random, and then you I guess you have a pen and paper and you write down what thoughts what you're experiencing. I don't know. Yeah. Well, what is descriptive experience sampling?
Yeah, a great question. So, yeah, actually, the original descriptive experience sampling method has nothing to do with sleeping. It's done while you're awake, and it's a technique developed by a psychologist by the name of Russell Hurlburt, and the purpose of it is to try to catch experience, conscious experience in its so-called pristine state, undisturbed by instructions, by attention shifts, by self-driven control, just the way the mind works on its own spontaneously. So what he does, which is different from what most scientists of the mind do, is he gives you a beeper. The beeper beeps at random times. He gives you an earpiece, so you can put it right in your ear and you can hear like sharply right away with like as little delay as possible. And he asks you to write down notes about what was in your mind, what you were experiencing at the time of the beep. And you're supposed to do this repeatedly a few times. And then, after you're done, within a few hours from you being done, he is going to interview you and he's going to try to help you pin down more precisely in words that other people can understand what the contents were of your experience. So, he's done this for many, many years with many, many people, some people with, special conditions, and that might help to gain insights into, I don't know, say the experience of people with schizophrenia or something. And lots of relatively normal people, neurotypicals. But yeah, he's never tried to study what happens to your experience when you sleep. So that was sort of my innovation, was to do it while I'm sleeping. And I did it in collaboration with him. So, I learned how to do it first, and then I tried to do it when I'm sleeping. And I started with naps, while I was napping, and I was always conscious when I was napping. So then I thought, oh, like what about when I go to sleep at night? And I was always conscious then too, until I figured out how to get the beeper to go off in the deepest space of sleep. And then I finally got situations where I could not detect anything going on in my mind at that moment. Although, even that is kind of subtle, but does that answer your question?
Yeah. It kind of reminds me of that famous technique that I don't know who used it, Edison or one of these guys where other people do too, where you hold a metal object, a ball or a spoon or something, and you sit and you drift off to sleep and it clings to the floor and you wake up. But this is only measuring one part of the process of that moment of when you start to get to the point of sleepiness where you open your hand and you drop the object. It's only this part. So this is like pinpointing other moments in the process as well.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, what you described is useful to try to catch the thoughts and the experiences that are occurring right at the moment when you're falling asleep. And but in the this method that I was using is more general because you can set it up, and I did set it up on purpose to go off, say, like 60 minutes after I go to sleep, so that it would catch the deepest phase of sleep. Like, and so that was not random anymore because I didn't want it random. I wanted it like at the moment of the deepest sleep, and we know independently when that happens, more or less.
But the larger point here is that we are largely conscious 24/7, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, even during the night, almost always. There's, if basically just the very short window when the brain fully shuts off and there's no, I mean, by shut off, it's not like it's not doing anything at all, but it's not going to have any conscious experiences going on in there. But it can still wake some people up. So like the brain is not dead. It's still going to be able to process information, but it's just very hard to get it to do it. Even to wake people up. So even waking people up in deep sleep is very difficult. They tend to sleep through, a lot of different disturbances because the brain is so kind of shut down. But there's other ways of shutting the brain down. There's anesthesia where you can also get the brain to basically shut down to where like there's no consciousness going on, and it's very difficult to wake people up, even harder than deep sleep. And of course, there's disturbance. There's like disorders of consciousness, like coma, minimally conscious state, unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. So those are also very fascinating conditions where we can try to understand is there consciousness at all and what kind of consciousness. It's very difficult though because you can't just directly ask people because they're impaired.
Okay, so this hard question of consciousness might not be just one question. It might be this series of, oh, well, these neural mechanisms, these ones lead to this 16-minute mark of when you're asleep, and this one leads to the experience of smelling the strawberries and oranges and looking at the sky and that kind of easy stuff. And then this one's there, and this one's Vipassana, and this one's Dzogchen, and all that kind of stuff. So, whoa, there might be like one method to explain it all, but it might be like maybe we'll crack the code at one little piece. Maybe it's like somewhere in the sleep cycle, and then from there, okay, now we're learning, and there might be a piece of consciousness that's like a type of consciousness that's like extra puzzling, and then but maybe like philosophy and science, we kind of just narrow down, and learn more and more and more, and start to explain more of consciousness.
Yeah, that's exactly what I think. I think, the more we kind of distinguish different aspects of consciousness and we relate the differences and the changes to changes and differences in the brain and aspects of how the brain works, different mechanisms at different scales, because again, there's different aspects to what the brain does. There's kind of these macro scale phenomena, for example, like large scale networks, neuromodulatory systems, and how they affect these large scale networks. Then there's the synchronization of the different systems. And so the neurons in these different systems, in these different networks, they can be more or less synchronized. The frequency and amplitude of these ways of activity in which they are synchronized. So there's these types of waves. Some waves are faster, shorter, and shorter amplitude, and others are slower, larger amplitude. All of this is affected by these neuromodulatory systems. These neuromodulatory systems, how do they work? Well, they bathe the brain in neurotransmitters. So there's a chemical aspect. They use different neurotransmitters. There's about 100 of them, but there's like a handful that are involved in neuromodulation on a global scale. So, you pump more norepinephrine or dopamine or acetylcholine, in the brain, and the right mixture of these things ends up activating, these large scale networks in different ways, which contributes to their waves, their synchronization patterns, uh, following these different regimes. So, so some of it is neurochemical and it involves specific neurotransmitters, and some of it is very large scale. And these things are interdependent. If you dump a bunch of these chemicals in the system as a whole, then there's going to be a certain pattern of interaction between the different parts of it. So we need to try to like break it down, like a little bit over here, a little bit over there, study like large scale patterns, the mid scale patterns, the small chemicals and how they go, where they go and when they go and how many and so forth.
I imagine that it's not like your whole brain. And then also we got to define what even is the brain. The brain kind of extends into the nervous system and maybe beyond, and into the
Yes.
body, and then maybe perhaps the environment. So it's like, oh, whoa, we got to understand that as well. But as well,
Yes.
even within the brain, it's like maybe this part of the prefrontal cortex has these kinds of waves and these neurochemicals flooding through it. But down here in the amygdala and hippocampus, it's a completely different story, and different networks and different parts of the brain might have a different neurochemical and electric kind of signature going on at the moment. So it's not like there's just one conscious. It's like we also have to figure out how these combine together. It's not just one thing going on. Like it's not I'm only in sort of desire dopamine mode. I'm also this part of me is in this kind of mode, and sort of overlapping onto each other. And this is sort of what you kind of realize in meditation, but you don't have to meditate to figure it out. It's kind of obvious. It's like while you're off, walking around looking at the sky and eating the strawberries and talking to your friends, you're thinking about something over here, but then you're kind of desiring something over here, and then there's all kinds of we're talking about these different types of consciousness. But my point here is it's not like they're just like taking turns. They're sometimes they're like three going on at the same time or 20 going on at the same time. And it's like ever changing. So it's like, woo. Again, I'm not a neuroscientist, but this is sort of my intuitive feel of what also explains how we move forward with this. It's not just a simple equation of, okay, what's going on? It's so many pieces.
Absolutely. There's two things I love about what you just said. One is it's also the body and environment. I don't want to give the impression that, oh, the brain does it and it could do it in a vat if we were a brain in a vat. But instead, the brain is like constantly interacting with with the rest of the body in ways that shape the brain activity itself. And the environment also matters. I mean, yes, we can shut it down while we sleep to a degree, In deep sleep, we do shut down everything. Almost, almost. But that's a very short amount. The most of the sleep happens with your brain still active, still somewhat shut off from the environment itself, and to some degree the body, especially when you're dreaming. You're paralyzed. But when we're awake, which is hugely important, for us to like learn anything, we're like interacting with the environment all the time, and it matters. It matters in lots and lots of ways. Some are like basic, and some are kind of more higher level. But yeah, there's this constant going back and forth. And I forgot what the other thing was that I liked about what you said. Maybe it'll come back up.
I sort of had 2 points. I kind of just blasted it all out, in one big dump. I didn't quite organize it, but yeah, I think one point was, yeah, it's not just the brain; it's the brain and the body and the environment. And the second point was how different regions or parts of the brain have different things going on at the same time. And then another way of explaining that was also that in our actual conscious experience, we're having different things going on at the same time, and that's creating a different sort of blend of flavor of experience.
Yes, and that's exactly the other thing that I love because, again, there is this assumption that many people have that there is one stream of consciousness. This is William James's image, in which you have like one experience and then another experience and then another experience. Is this like flow of coherent unitary experience. But in reality, you are right. There's not just one thing going on. And this is one of the important results of the studies by Russell Herbert using descriptive experience sampling is that typically people report between 2 and 4 different experiences going on in their mind at the same time when it's done, in this kind of relatively rigorous way. And it could be more, it could be one, sometimes it's just one. And I've done it myself, so I can kind of testify that I've done the script experience sampling when I was awake, and generally it's typically between 2 and 4 different things going on. They're not like directly related. So, people talk about the unity of consciousness. That's another one of these aspects of consciousness. And there's some unity, but there's also some disunity. There's more than one thing happening at the same time. Yes.
So if we have these typically 2 to 4 types of consciousness going on at the same time, it seems like most of us, or at least usually for me, I'm focusing on one of them, maybe two of them. One's sort of in the background, but I'm kind of trying to focus on one of them. But again, maybe I should be doing the other thing. Sometimes is trying to open up the gates of 4 of them or 5 of them and saying, oh, what actually is going on right now? It's more than what I thought. And this is my question for you is how are some ways? What are some methods or something for us to access these other parts of our consciousness that are going on, you know, even while we're awake?
Yeah. Great question. It's very hard to do without an external prompt like the beeper that Herbert uses, because your own effort to pay attention to your mind ends up backgrounding almost everything that's happening except the one thing you're focusing on. And some people even think like attention and consciousness are basically the same thing. We're conscious of what we pay attention to. But that's an artifact of of what happens when you try to pay attention to your mind, is that you end up selecting something and ignoring the rest, and the rest kind of fades because you choose something to focus on. So I think the way to do that, to like get around that, is use something like a beeper, preferably something that beeps at random. But you can set itself an alarm. The way I would do it, if you wanted to try kind of at home, is set an alarm that rings very like sharply, has a sharp beginning. Put it in your ears with like some kind of earplug so that there's no delay. You hear right away. Set it at a time that's delayed enough that you'll sort of forget about it. Not like in 30 seconds or in 1 minute, but maybe like 10 minutes, something like that. So you have time to just sort of start wandering about other things and think about other things, and then see what you're experiencing when the thing goes off. If you can focus just at that moment. So just kind of prompt yourself and say, like, okay, when I hear the beep, I'm going to try to write down everything that I'm aware of at that moment and see if how many things you're aware of. And it may well be that it's, 2, 3, maybe even 4 unrelated things, like it could be the color of something that you're seeing, and also some sensation in your right elbow, and also that you're thinking about something completely unrelated at the same time.
How can we use all this to remember more, improve our memory, and learning? Like you said, it's hard to do when you're in deep sleep. It's one, there's not much going on, but even our dreams, we don't often remember those for whatever reasons, and even our experiences. Some people just like they might not remember their childhood. They might not remember what they did yesterday, even. So, yeah, of course, pen and paper, being awake kind of helps. But yeah, what are some ways how we can maybe use some of that information to remember more of what we want to remember?
Yes. I mean, taking notes is a way, but then the memory is really in the notes, not in ourselves. I mean, that can still be useful. But the brain does it on its own, largely when we're asleep automatically. So the way to improve that is get good. And this is a huge discovery from the last few decades, by the way. People did not used to appreciate how critical good sleep is to memory and learning. So there's this process called memory consolidation that happens mostly during sleep. And if we don't get good sleep, it's a lot harder to remember things and to learn things. So what we can do is try to optimize our health and our brain health and our sleep, so that number one, we are more awake and more focused when we are awake because we got good sleep and we're rested. And number two, we can go through this process of memory consolidation during sleep, which we don't have to try to control. The brain does it on its own. But that goes into the whole like health aspect of your podcast because to get good sleep and to be focused during the day, kind of general health is important. There's like supplements that you can maybe use if you are deficient in certain nutrients. And then more generally, like I would say avoid mind altering substances. Like alcohol is a big disruptor of these processes, but other drugs can mess with it too. So it's a lot harder to focus, learn, and remember things if your mind is not working on its own in its own sort of balanced way because you've injected something that changes it. With like rare exceptions, like there's a ginkgo biloba is like a kind of supplement that helps you focus a little bit better without like messing things up. But, even coffee can be too much, if you overdo it.
You're not a typical philosopher. I think why I left philosophy. I mean, I only went to through the undergrad level. Is I did love it, but everyone was just in their head, and there was a couple of professors who were branching outside of just pure philosophy, analytic philosophy, and they were like sort of they're also neuroscientists, but they were very very rare, and I feared, and I was also in my head so much, and I was a brain in a vat or something, and then, so I was curious and craving getting into the body and getting into the world. So I was like, okay, maybe I just have to do this. I have to leave. So I went off to Asia and explored and traveled and stuff, and I'm still here. But my point here is, yeah, I kind of feared that I was gonna become even more disembodied, more of a brain in a vat, and then I almost got this sort of not disgust towards philosophy, but like, come on, this can't be right. This doesn't feel like this is reality. This is parts of what they're saying is true, but there's all these kind of bullshit questions we're doing. What are we wasting our time for? So I think a lot of people get this experience at some point in the philosophy process. So I left. But now talking to you, and maybe had I had more professors like you, I would have been more attracted to keep doing it because you're like, oh, I don't have to give up everything else. I don't have to give up my body in the world and experience and these other sort of soft emotional things, and also just bridging it into other fields. We can put it all together. So yeah, I guess I'm curious, like, what was your process like in your philosophy journey of believing in philosophy and not believing in it, and changing the way you approach it, or and how did you kind of become this sort of multidisciplinary, more open-minded philosopher?
Yeah, interesting question. It was definitely a journey, and there's sort of an intellectual journey or intellectual side of the journey where I was always interested in science as well, empirical questions, understanding how the mind works. We're not going to understand that without studying it empirically. But then there's a personal side. I used to be a very anxious person and very in my head, as you would say, brain in a vat kind of a life. So these two things sort of evolved interacting with each other. But I had to learn slowly to manage my anxiety, to like get a more embodied experience and embedded in the world and mindful. And one thing that helped me a ton is meditation. And another thing which is related to meditation is Tai Chi Chuan, which is a kind of so-called internal martial art and has a meditative aspect and a mindfulness aspect. And I've practiced Tai Chi for 30 years. So, over time, that's one thing that helped me. And there's other things, other things helped. So, yeah, progressively, I've become more comfortable, in my body, in my skin, less anxious. Aging probably helps on its own, getting older. But yeah, I can understand exactly what you mean because people who are very quote unquote intellectual often are prone to being too much in their head. And often that does correlate with anxiety and maybe even depression for some people. So that goes back to the health aspect. If you like overthink things too much, it leads to unhealthy patterns. So the antidote to that is do more with your body, be mindful, be in the moment, meditate, or even just simply use your hands, do something with your hands. do something with your body, work out, go for a walk, take the dog out.
Maybe just do the opposite of you, because it's like you think this is me. I'm this guy. I'm a smart guy. I'm a guy who thinks I'm good at philosophy or whatever. And then, oh, I'm not this body thing. Maybe try playing a sport and see. Maybe you're not who you thought you were.
Yeah, that's right.
But then the question too is identity. Do we have to figure it out? Like, who am I? But you kind of want to, because it kind of highlights what actions you take and where you go in the future, and what your life is about. So how do we use all this to figure out who we are? Or is this just another one of these silly philosophy questions?
I don't think it's a silly philosophy question. I think it's a complex question. One of my earliest Tai Chi teachers, who was a master level teacher, had this analogy. Think of your life as a string, and the string, kind of unravels as you live. Now, take the end of the string that you're at now. Can you pull the string and feel it all connected from its beginning? And if you can feel that, you can kind of get tension in there and it's all connected, then you're living well. But if it feels like all tangled, there's all these knots, or these like twists and turns in the string, and you can't quite reach the other end by pulling, it means you're not quite there. You're not living well. You're not living with integrity. So I always thought that was a powerful image. It's a little bit like a puzzle. Like, what does that mean? But it stuck with me. Like, I heard this 30 years ago, and it stuck with me. And it's something you can always, you can always improve, like learning about yourself. But you want to try to do it with integrity, not just go for like the easy fix, or the immediate instant gratification. But what matters for real, what's really important to you. And you can't learn it just by thinking. You have to live, you have to experiment, try things, and be considerate of other people. Think about how you fit in the world, the world at large, the planet. It's not just you. It's you in this body, in this environment, with these people on this planet. And then you can figure it out a little bit at a time.
Are there some things, or like methods, or experiments, or experiences that helped you learn more about yourself? And then I guess you think you figure out who you are, but then, like, for example, for me, like, I kind of hated that Vipassana retreat, but like I learned more about myself than anywhere, like any other time in my life, because one, they took off all of your distractions. No pen, no paper, no phone, no talking, no nothing. You're only meditating like for 10 days straight, like 10 hours a day. And they want you to be in this like position where you're not even moving. So there's stillness. They don't want you to use your imagination or nothing. So it's like really, really rigid kind of thing. But through that sort of painful, weird, hard process, you can't help it. Unconscious starts to unfold and open up before your eyes. And this is just one example. This kind of this meditation experience kind of, I learned about myself. But you learn about yourself in all kinds of other ways, through traveling and having some chaos happen or whatever. But yeah, how can we learn more about ourselves, and how did you learn more about yourself?
Yeah, good. I agree, first of all, that trying different things is a huge way to learn about yourself. Specifically, some of going to a meditation retreat, is a great way, because, it puts you outside of your comfort zone with people who have gone there before you, and they might have things to teach you. So seeking teachers, all kinds of teachers, philosophy teachers, sure, maybe, but also meditation teachers, martial art teachers, counselors, psychologists. I mean, there's all kinds of potential people you can learn, mentors in your profession, whatever profession it is, there's going to be people who can teach you how to do it well with integrity. And then overcoming challenges. So challenges, you can choose them for yourself sometimes, even going to a retreat could be a challenge, but sometimes they hit you from the outside and you learn a lot by figuring out how to get over that. But the one thing that I think is crucial, and we're losing some of that ability in our society these days, is don't do it alone, okay? Yeah, you need to work on yourself, yes, but don't think you have to or can do it alone. You also need to build a network of people around you. And since, society is getting more fragmented, we're all like on a phone all the time on a screen, instead of with people. Well, one way or another, you have to work on building those connections with other people. We are a social species. We need other people. We need other people to even figure ourselves out, to get feedback. Like that's what we're doing. You and I are doing right now. We're talking to each other, and we never talked before. But here we are trying to have a valuable conversation. And you can repeat that with many, many, many other people and then cultivate those relationships, not just one off. I mean, in our case, I don't expect us to talk anytime soon again, but you see my point. You have family, keep them close if possible. If you can get along with them, and try to get along with them, because those are priceless relationships. But then build other relationships, friends, partners, whatever works for you. But you need those other people, trusted people, to also get back to you and say, like, hey, and hold you accountable too. You want people to hold you accountable. Hey, what's this bullshit that you're doing right now? No, no, that doesn't work. That's not okay. That's not the way to do this. You can do better than that, and you can figure out things about yourself that way.
Yeah, and not just learning about yourself, but learning about anything, or trying to do anything. Oftentimes it helps to be with other people. I've been thinking through your philosophies and this stuff on my own, sitting in my room. But I learned way more about it just talking to you for an hour. So that's kind of comforting as well. And it's nice that we were able to have this conversation. And I appreciate this time together. And I learned a lot about the brain and myself a little bit, and had a nice connection with you. So I appreciate this. If people want to learn more about your work, or connect or anything like that, where do you recommend they go?
Well, there's some other interviews of me and about my work, that you can find if you Google it on YouTube. And then there's academic websites where some of my published work is available. But if you can't find enough that way, send me an email. I'll send you something.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't expect to see you again soon, but if we do, it'll be a pleasant delight. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks a lot, Michael. Take care.